In the Reed family, Madison was never wrong. She was sensitive, overwhelmed, misunderstood, or just having a hard day. Those were the words my mother used whenever my younger sister crossed a line. If Madison broke something, she had been careless because she was emotional. If Madison insulted someone, she was only being honest. If Madison cried after hurting me, somehow I became the one expected to comfort her. I learned that rule early. When I was 10, Madison knocked my grandmother's glass swan from the dining room shelf. It shattered across the hardwood floor before I could even move. Madison screamed first, and my mother came running. She looked at the broken glass, then looked at me. "Why weren't you watching her?" she asked. I tried to explain that Madison had picked it up on her own, but Mom only shook her head. "She's 6, Hannah. You're old enough to know better." That night, I apologized for the broken swan. Madison got ice cream because she had been so upset. That was the pattern of my childhood. Madison made the mess, I absorbed the blame, and my mother called it being a good older sister. By the time I was a teenager, I understood my role so well that I often apologized before anyone told me to. If Madison was embarrassed, I had to shrink myself. If she wanted something I had to prove I loved her by giving it up. If I ever resisted, my mother would sigh and say, "Hannah, don't make everything a fight." When I won a writing award in high school, I came home with the certificate carefully tucked inside my backpack. I imagined my mother smiling, maybe putting it on the fridge, like she used to do with Madison's dance photos. Instead, she glanced at it and lowered her voice. "Don't bring this up at dinner. Madison didn't make the cheer team today, and she's devastated." I nodded because that was what I had been trained to do. The certificate stayed in my desk drawer until the edges curled. Madison, meanwhile, learned that tears could erase almost anything. When she failed a class, my mother blamed the teacher. When she lost friends, my mother said the other girls were jealous. When she spent money she didn't have, my mother called it stress. Once, during my second year of college, Madison ran up a credit card bill on clothes, makeup, and a weekend trip with friends. My mother sat at the kitchen table rubbing her back while Madison cried into a tissue. Then Mom turned to me and asked whether I could help cover part of it with the money from my internship. I told her that money was for rent and tuition. She said, "Your sister made a mistake. Don't punish her for being human." I paid half. No one paid me back. Outsiders thought we were a perfect family. We had the Reed name, a beautiful house, and a grandfather who had built Reed Holdings from one failing warehouse into a company with investments, properties, and a respected charitable foundation. At public events, my mother stood beside Madison as if she had raised a fragile angel. Madison knew how to smile for donors, how to laugh softly when older relatives complimented her, and how to call me the serious one in a way that made everyone else laugh too. I stood beside them and made sure the reservation was correct. The coats were collected, the gifts were labeled, and Madison got home safely when she drank too much. My mother called me dependable. For years, I mistook that for praise. Later, I realized it was more like a job title. The only person who seemed to notice was my grandfather, Arthur Reed. He was not a warm man in the obvious ways. He rarely hugged, rarely praised, and never raised his voice unless someone had truly earned it. But he watched everything. At family dinners, his silence was not absence. It was measurement. He noticed who interrupted whom, who cleaned up after whom, and who received forgiveness before they even asked for it. One Friday evening, a few months before everything changed, we gathered at my mother's house for dinner. Grandpa sat at the head of the table with his cane resting beside his chair, thinner than he had been the year before, but still sharp-eyed. Madison arrived late in a cream dress and a diamond bracelet I knew she couldn't afford. She kissed Grandpa on the cheek, sat down, and immediately started talking about a charity gala she wanted to host under the family foundation's name. "It would bring younger donors in," Madison said, lifting her glass. "Something fresh, glamorous, high profile. The foundation needs that." Grandpa asked, "How much would this cost?" Madison smiled, as if details were beneath the vision. "Maybe $80,000 to start." I looked down at my plate before my expression betrayed me. Grandpa did not. He simply asked, "To raise how much?" Madison paused. "That depends on attendance, sponsors, the overall vibe." "Vibe is not a financial plan," Grandpa said. Madison's cheeks flushed. My mother immediately leaned toward her. "Dad, she's trying to help. Don't discourage her." "I asked a question," Grandpa replied. Madison's eyes filled with tears right on cue. "I knew this would happen. Every time I try to contribute, everyone treats me like I'm stupid." No one had said that, but the room changed shape around her as it always did. My mother reached for Madison's hand, then turned to me. "Hannah, say something. Your sister feels unsupported." I set my fork down carefully. "I think Grandpa is only asking for a budget. If foundation money is involved, there should be details." Madison let out a small laugh. "Of course you'd say that. You always want to sound like the responsible one." I felt the familiar heat rise in my face, but before I could respond, my mother snapped, "Hannah, don't escalate." "I didn't," I said. Quieter than I wanted to. "You know Madison is sensitive about being taken seriously. You could have been kinder." Grandpa's cane tapped once against the floor. It was not loud, but everyone stopped. He looked at my mother and said, "Vivian, your older daughter answered a question. Your younger daughter insulted her." Madison stared at him as if he had slapped her. My mother stiffened. "Dad, that's unfair." "What is unfair," Grandpa said, "is training one child to carry consequences while teaching the other to escape them." Madison pushed back her chair, burst into tears, and ran upstairs. My mother followed without hesitation. A door slammed above us. I sat frozen at the table, fighting the old instinct to go after them and make things smooth again. Grandpa looked at me and said, "Don't." I swallowed. "Don't what?" "Don't go upstairs and make yourself smaller so they can feel bigger." The words hit me harder than I expected. I had spent most of my life being called strong, mature, dependable, and difficult whenever I asked for fairness. No one had ever said so plainly that I was being asked to disappear. After dinner, while my mother stayed upstairs comforting Madison, Grandpa found me near the front door with my coat in my hands. He told me to come by his office on Monday morning because there were foundation files he wanted me to review. I almost refused. If Madison learned that Grandpa was involving me in family business, she would treat it like betrayal, and my mother would somehow make me apologize for accepting an invitation I had not asked for. "I don't know if that's a good idea," I said. Grandpa studied me for a moment. "That is exactly why it is a good idea." On Monday, I went to Reed Holdings. His office sat behind glass doors on the top floor, overlooking the city his company had helped build. He handed me donor reports, clinic applications, and grant requests. For 2 hours, I read through budgets, patient numbers, and funding gaps. Grandpa said little, but he watched closely. When I pointed out that one small clinic served more patients than a much flashier proposal requesting 3 times the money, he smiled faintly. "You noticed that," he said. "It seemed important." "It is," he replied. Before I left, he leaned back in his chair and looked out the window. "Your mother thinks Madison needs protection from the world. She has confused protection with permission." I did not know what to say. He opened a drawer and touched a black folder inside, though he did not show me its contents. "There are arrangements I should have made sooner," he said. "Things that make sure the truth still has a voice when I no longer do." A cold unease moved through me. I wanted to ask what he meant, but his expression told me the answer would come later. At the time, I thought he was only talking about business, inheritance, or the family foundation. I had no idea that within months, those words would matter inside a hospital room while I fought for air and my mother chose Madison again. After that Monday morning at Reed Holdings, Grandpa began asking me to visit his office twice a week. He never announced it to the family, and I never did either. I knew what would happen if Madison found out too soon. She would turn it into betrayal. Mom would call it unnecessary secrecy, and somehow I would be expected to apologize for accepting an invitation I had not asked for. So I went quietly after work, took the elevator to the top floor, and sat across from Grandpa while the city lights came on beyond the glass windows. At first, I thought he only wanted help with foundation paperwork. The Reed Family Foundation funded medical clinics, patient housing, emergency grants, and scholarship programs, but Grandpa believed too many proposals were approved because they looked polished rather than because they helped people. He handed me files and asked me to read them carefully. Not quickly, not politely, but honestly. That was new to me. In my mother's house, honesty was treated like cruelty whenever it made Madison uncomfortable. In Grandpa's office, honesty was expected. One evening, I reviewed 2 funding requests. One came from a downtown wellness center with glossy photographs, celebrity donors, and an expensive campaign video. The other came from a small respiratory clinic on the edge of the city. Its proposal was plain, almost clumsy, but the numbers were impossible to ignore. They treated more patients, charged less, and helped people recovering from surgery who had nowhere else to go. I marked the respiratory clinic as the stronger request and explained why. Grandpa read my notes, then looked at me with the faintest smile. "You looked past presentation." "It wasn't hard," I said. The need was clearer. "That is exactly why most people miss it," he replied. That was the first time he mentioned Dr. Elias Grant. He told me the clinic worked with several surgeons, but Grant was different. He took difficult cases, listened before judging, and had no patience for families who tried to rewrite medical facts to protect their own comfort. I thought Grandpa was only explaining why he trusted the clinic. I did not understand why he looked so serious when he slid a small card across the desk with the doctor's name and number written on it. "If your breathing gets worse, call him," Grandpa said. I stared at the card. "My breathing?" "You've been short of breath." I wanted to deny it. That was my first instinct, because in my family, pain was only safe if it stayed invisible. The tightness in my chest had started weeks earlier. Sometimes it came after climbing stairs. Sometimes it arrived at night, sharp and sudden, making me sit upright in bed until I could breathe normally again. I had told myself it was stress. "It's nothing," I said. Grandpa's expression hardened. "That is not your voice. That is what they trained you to say." I looked away. He was right, and I hated that he was right. If Madison had coughed twice, Mom would have scheduled 3 appointments and blamed the air quality. If I admitted I was struggling to breathe, Mom would ask whether I was trying to make everyone worry about me, so I had learned to minimize everything before anyone else could. Grandpa did not push further. He only tapped the card once. "Keep it." I placed it in my purse, unsettled by the weight of something so small. The secret of my visits did not last. Madison found out before the next family dinner. She arrived at Mom's house already angry, dressed beautifully, smiling too brightly, and waiting until everyone sat down before she said, "So, are we pretending Hannah isn't trying to become Grandpa's chosen heir?" My mother froze. "Madison, not at dinner." Madison looked at me. "You've been going to his office twice a week. Nobody told me. Why hide it unless there's something to hide?" I kept my voice calm. "Grandpa asked me to review foundation files." "How convenient," she said. "You always know how to look responsible." Mom turned to me with that familiar disappointed look. "Hannah, you should have told your sister. She feels excluded." I didn't exclude her. It wasn't my decision. "But you knew how this would make her feel." That sentence was the foundation of my entire childhood. Madison's feelings were treated like evidence, and I was always the accused. Before I could answer, Grandpa set down his glass. "If Madison wants to help the foundation," he said, "she can begin by reading the annual reports." Madison's face flushed. "I can do more than read reports." "Then reading them should not frighten you." Mom's voice sharpened. "Dad, don't embarrass her." "I am not embarrassing her," Grandpa said. "I am refusing to reward entitlement." The rest of dinner was cold and tense. Madison barely spoke, but I knew silence from her was never surrender. After dessert, she caught me in the hallway while Mom was in the kitchen and Grandpa was speaking with the driver outside. "You think you're winning," Madison said. I looked at her. "Winning what?" "Don't act innocent. Grandpa feels sorry for you, and you're using it." "I'm helping with paperwork." "No," she said, stepping closer. "You're trying to take my place." The words exposed more than she meant to reveal. Until then, I had thought she was angry because she felt left out. In that hallway, I realized it was deeper. Madison did not want to help the foundation. She wanted the position of being valued without doing the work. Grandpa's trust in me threatened the order she had lived under her whole life. I said quietly, "Maybe you're just not used to something being earned." Her face changed. For 1 second, there were no tears, no trembling voice, no fragile mask. There was only rage. Then she turned toward the kitchen and cried, "Mom?" By the time Mom appeared, Madison's eyes were wet. Hannah said, "I don't deserve anything." I felt the old exhaustion settle into my bones. That's not what I said. Mom didn't ask what happened. She never did when Madison cried first. "Hannah, why would you say something like that?" "I didn't." Madison covered her mouth. "She hates me." Mom wrapped an arm around her, already choosing the version that required the least discomfort from Madison and the most silence from me. "Enough. Your sister is upset." Grandpa came back inside during the last few words. He looked from Madison to Mom, then to me. He did not need the whole story. He had spent years watching the pattern. "Vivian," he said, "come with me." Mom tried to refuse, but he did not move until she followed him into the sitting room. Madison went with her, still crying, though the sound faded the moment the door closed. I stayed in the hallway, not because anyone told me to, but because some part of me was tired of chasing a trial where the verdict had been written before I spoke. When the door opened 10 minutes later, Mom walked past me with anger in her face. Madison followed, refusing to look at me. Grandpa remained in the sitting room and called my name. Inside, the black folder lay open on his desk. I saw only a sealed envelope and the edge of legal papers before he closed it. His hand rested on top of it, as if the folder contained something heavier than documents. "I have made some changes," he said. "To the foundation?" "To more than the foundation." I went still. "Because of tonight?" "Because tonight is not new," he said. "It is only clearer." I did not know what to say. Grandpa's voice softened, but his eyes stayed sharp. "Your mother has spent years protecting Madison from consequences. That has made Madison careless. One day, carelessness becomes cruelty, and cruelty becomes danger." A chill ran through me. He picked up the card with Dr. Grant's name again, copied the number onto another slip, and placed it in the black folder. "There will be legal arrangements. There will also be medical witnesses if necessary." "Medical witnesses?" I asked. "If they ever try to convince people that your pain is performance, I want someone outside this family able to speak." The room felt suddenly too quiet. I wanted to tell him he was overreacting, but the words would not come. Maybe because some part of me already knew he was not. Before I left, Grandpa took my hand briefly. It was the closest he ever came to a comforting gesture. "Hannah, if the truth ever costs you their approval, choose the truth." At the time, I thought he was preparing me for another family fight, another accusation, another dinner where Madison cried, and Mom demanded I apologize. I did not know he was preparing me for the day I would lie in a hospital bed, gasping for air, while my mother defended the person who had taken my oxygen away. For 2 weeks after Grandpa gave me Dr. Grant's card, I carried it in my purse and pretended I did not need it. The tightness in my chest had started small, easy to blame on stress or poor sleep, but it kept returning at stranger times. I felt it climbing stairs, walking from the parking garage, and sometimes in the middle of the night, when I woke sitting upright with one hand pressed against my ribs, waiting for my lungs to cooperate. I told myself it was nothing, because in my family, pain was safer when no one could see it. That changed one afternoon in Grandpa's office. I was reviewing a grant request when the words on the page blurred and a hard pressure closed around my chest. I tried to inhale, but the breath would not come fully. Grandpa noticed before I could hide it. He called Dr. Grant himself, and by evening, I was sitting in the respiratory clinic I had once recommended for foundation funding, answering questions I had been avoiding for weeks. Dr. Elias Grant did not treat me like a woman looking for attention. He listened, examined me, ordered scans, and explained the results without softening the truth into something easier to ignore. There was a complication affecting my breathing. It was serious, and if it continued untreated, it could become dangerous. I would need more tests, then most likely a surgical procedure, followed by monitored recovery and oxygen support. I should have been thinking about the surgery, but my first fear was my mother. I could already hear her voice, asking whether the doctor was being dramatic, whether Grandpa had influenced me, whether stress was making me exaggerate. When I told her that night, she did exactly what I feared. She listened just long enough to sound concerned, then said, "Hannah, are you sure this isn't being blown out of proportion?" "A surgeon told me this," I said. "Doctors are cautious. You've been under pressure lately, especially with your grandfather pulling you into foundation matters. Maybe your body is reacting to stress." "It isn't stress." "I'm not saying you're lying," she said, using the careful voice that always came before she doubted me. "I'm saying you sometimes internalize things." Madison called less than an hour later. She did not ask if I was okay. She said, "So now you're sick?" "That's what the scans show." "How convenient. Grandpa starts paying attention to you, and suddenly you have some mysterious condition. Only his special doctor understands." I hung up before I said something I would later be forced to apologize for. It did not matter. By Sunday dinner, Madison's version had already traveled through the family. One aunt asked if I had anxiety breathing. A cousin suggested meditation. Madison sat across the table, calm and polished, while my mother corrected no one. When Grandpa asked about my next appointment, Madison rolled her eyes. There it is, the medical update. Grandpa set down his fork. "If you have something to say it plainly." Madison smiled. "Fine. I think Hannah likes being fragile when it benefits her." I looked at my mother. "Are you going to let her call me a liar?" Mom's mouth tightened. "She didn't use that word. She's scared, Hannah. This is hard for her, too." I almost laughed because I was the one struggling to breathe, yet Madison's fear still mattered more than my illness. Grandpa's expression turned cold. "Vivian, fear does not give one daughter permission to mock the other's medical condition." Madison's eyes filled immediately. "I can't say anything in this family anymore." That was the lie she survived on. Madison had always been able to say anything. I was the one expected to survive it quietly. The final tests confirmed Dr. Grant's warning. I needed surgery. He explained the risks, the recovery plan, and the oxygen support I would require afterward. Grandpa wanted to take me, but Mom insisted she would be there because she was my mother. A part of me still wanted to believe that a hospital would change the rules, that illness would finally make me her child instead of Madison's burden. On the morning of the procedure, Mom arrived late with Madison beside her. Madison wore sunglasses inside and complained about the smell of disinfectant. "Hospitals make me anxious," she said, pressing a hand to her chest. Mom rubbed her arm. "I know, sweetheart. Just breathe." I was lying in the bed with an IV in my hand, waiting to be taken into surgery. Still, Madison was the one being comforted. Dr. Grant entered before the silence could swallow me. He reviewed the procedure and asked whether I had questions. Madison interrupted him. "How serious is this really?" Dr. Grant turned to her. "Serious enough to require surgery. But not life or death, right? It can become life-threatening if ignored." Mom gave a nervous smile. "Madison is only asking because she's scared." Dr. Grant's tone stayed calm. "Fear is not a reason to minimize another person's medical condition." No one answered. For the first time in a long while, someone had said in one sentence what I had spent years being unable to prove. The surgery went forward. When I woke, everything felt heavy and distant. My chest hurt, my throat was dry, and a clear oxygen tube rested beneath my nose. "Doctor, Grant told me the procedure had gone as planned, but recovery mattered. I needed rest, medication, oxygen support, and as little stress as possible." Grandpa visited that evening despite Mom saying he should wait. He stood beside my bed, looked at the oxygen line, then at my face. "You do not have to prove pain to people committed to doubting it," he said. I was too tired to answer, but I held his hand until the nurse came in. For the next 2 days, recovery moved slowly. Nurses checked my oxygen levels. Dr. Grant adjusted my medication. Grandpa called often. Mom visited too, but every visit became about Madison's discomfort. Madison felt ignored. Madison was upset that Grandpa kept asking about me. Madison thought the family group chat had turned into Hannah's medical diary, even though I had barely texted anyone. On the 3rd day, Mom and Madison came in just after lunch. I was exhausted, still on oxygen, trying to stay awake while Dr. Grant reviewed my chart outside the room. Madison stood at the foot of my bed with her arms crossed, staring at me as if the tubes and monitors were props I had arranged for sympathy. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You're still doing it." I frowned. "Doing what?" "Playing weak. Grandpa is worried sick, Mom is stressed, everyone keeps talking about you. Are you happy now?" Mom touched Madison's shoulder. "Calm down." But she did not tell her to stop. I tried to sit up, and pain pulled through my chest. "Please leave if you're going to do this." Madison stepped closer. "There it is. The poor patient act." The monitor beside me began to beep faster. My breathing turned shallow. Mom glanced at the screen, then back at Madison, still more worried about her feelings than my air. "Hannah," Mom said, "don't upset your sister." That sentence broke something quiet inside me. I was in a hospital bed after surgery, breathing through a tube, and somehow I was still responsible for Madison's comfort. Outside the room, I heard Dr. Grant speaking to a nurse. Madison heard him too. Her expression tightened, and she leaned closer to me. "You won't keep fooling everyone forever," she whispered. In that moment, I understood the truth Grandpa had seen before I did. Madison was not just jealous anymore. She was afraid, because medical records could not be cried away. Dr. Grant could not be charmed, and Grandpa finally had proof that I was not pretending. For the first time in her life, Madison was facing facts she could not bend, and that made her dangerous. Madison stood at the foot of my hospital bed, staring at the oxygen tube beneath my nose as if it offended her. My mother stayed beside her, one hand resting on Madison's shoulder, comforting her before anyone had even harmed her. I was still weak from surgery, my chest aching with every breath, but somehow, the room had already arranged itself around Madison's feelings. "You need to leave," I said. "I'm tired." Madison gave a bitter little laugh. "Of course you are. That's always your excuse." Mom sighed. "Hannah, your sister came here because she was worried. She hasn't asked me once if I'm okay." Madison's expression hardened. "Because this isn't about being okay. This is about attention. Grandpa keeps calling. The nurses keep checking on you. Doctor Grant walks in here like you're the most important person in the hospital. You finally got what you wanted." I looked at her, too exhausted to hide my disbelief. "You think I wanted surgery?" "I think you wanted everyone watching you." Mom did not correct her. She only squeezed Madison's shoulder, as if my sister's cruelty was something painful happening to her instead of something she was doing to me. Outside the room, I could hear Dr. Grant speaking with a nurse near the hallway. That should have made me feel safer. But Madison heard him too, and her face changed. The anger in her eyes sharpened into panic. "She always does this," Madison said, stepping closer. "She acts helpless, then everyone rushes to protect her. Grandpa, especially. And now his doctor says she's sick. His foundation files are in her hands, and we're all supposed to believe that's a coincidence? That was when I understood what truly frightened her. It was not my illness. It was the fact that my illness could no longer be dismissed as drama. Medical records existed. Dr. Grant believed me. Grandpa believed me. For once, Madison's tears could not rewrite the truth. "I'm not taking anything from you," I said. Madison's mouth twisted. "That's what people say when they've already taken it." Mom finally moved half a step between us. "Both of you need to calm down." I stared at her. "Both of us?" "This is stressful for everyone," she said. I almost asked how my recovery had become Madison's crisis, but I had asked that question in different forms my entire life. My mother never answered it. She only found new ways to make me responsible for Madison's comfort. Madison's eyes dropped again to the oxygen tube. "Take it off," she said. I froze. "What?" "If you're not putting on a show, take it off for 1 minute." Mom's face paled. "Madison, don't." But there was no real force in her voice. It sounded like she was afraid of embarrassment, not danger. I pressed my hand over the tube. "Dr. Grant said I need it." "Of course he did," Madison snapped. "Because he says whatever makes you look weak." "Step back," I said. She moved too fast for me to stop her. Her hand shot out, yanked the tube from beneath my nose, and for one stunned second, I only felt the sharp pull against my skin. Then my body understood before my mind did. The air that had been helping me breathe was gone. My chest tightened violently, pain spreading beneath my ribs as I tried to inhale and failed to get enough. The monitor began beeping faster. I reached for the call button, but my fingers shook and slipped against the blanket. Madison stood frozen with the tube partly in her hand. Her face had gone pale, but she did not put it back. "Hannah?" Mom said, finally looking at me. I tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. My hand clawed at the bed rail. I could see my mother seeing me. She saw my mouth open around broken breaths. She saw the monitor flashing. She saw the oxygen tube hanging loose from Madison's hand. And still, her first instinct was to grab Madison and pull her close. "I didn't mean to," Madison cried. "She provoked me." Mom held her tighter. "It's okay, sweetheart. You panicked." That sentence almost hurt more than the lack of air. I was the one gasping in the bed, but Madison was the one being comforted. I finally hit the call button, and at the same moment, Dr. Grant came through the door. He took in the scene instantly. The loose oxygen tube, Madison crying, my mother shielding her, the numbers dropping on the monitor. His voice was calm, but it cut through the room. "Move away from the bed." Madison stepped back. Mom opened her mouth to explain, but Dr. Grant was already at my side, replacing the tube and adjusting the oxygen flow. A nurse rushed in behind him. He told me to take slow breaths, and I tried to follow his voice through the panic. Air returned in pieces, first too little, then enough to keep the room from tilting. Dr. Grant looked at the nurse. "Document the oxygen displacement, the patient's distress, and the visitors present in the room." Mom stiffened. "Doctor, it was an accident." "I did not ask for an interpretation," he said. "I asked for documentation." Madison began sobbing harder. I got scared. She kept saying things to me, and I just reacted. I forced the words through my aching throat. She pulled it out. Mom turned to me with a look of warning disguised as disappointment. "Stop blaming her. She was just scared." The room went silent except for the monitor. There it was, spoken beside my hospital bed, while I was still struggling to breathe. The same rule that had governed my entire life. Madison could harm me, and I would still be expected to protect her from the consequences. Dr. Grant turned slowly toward my mother. "Mrs. Reed, your daughter is recovering from surgery and requires oxygen support." Removing it was not a harmless emotional reaction. "My younger daughter was distressed," Mom said. "And your older daughter was deprived of prescribed oxygen." The nurse kept typing. Madison noticed and cried more quietly, as if she had realized tears could not stop a medical record. Mom noticed too. Her eyes moved from the chart to the monitor, then back to Dr. Grant. "I don't want this exaggerated," she said. "Medical records are not written to protect family comfort," Dr. Grant replied. Madison whispered, "Am I going to get in trouble?" "I am going to record what happened," he said. That frightened her more than anger would have. Madison knew how to survive shouting. She knew how to cry until Mom rescued her. But a written record was different. It did not care that she was sensitive. It did not soften because she was scared. Dr. Grant told them both to leave. Mom lingered at the door, and for one foolish second, I thought she might look back at me with regret. Instead, she said, "You know she didn't mean it." I turned my face toward the window and said nothing. I understood then that my mother did not need Madison to be innocent. She only needed me to keep pretending Madison was. After the door closed, Dr. Grant checked my oxygen level again. His voice lowered. "Hannah, what happened here was serious." I nodded, too tired to speak. "And I am documenting it as such." I closed my eyes. Relief and fear moved through me at the same time. For the first time, the truth had been written down by someone my family could not control, but I knew them too well to believe it was over. They would not ask why Madison had taken my oxygen away. They would ask how to make me forgive her, before anyone else found out. By the next morning, my mother had already started rewriting what happened. She did not call it Madison pulling out my oxygen tube. She called it a misunderstanding, a frightening moment, an emotional reaction. When she came back to the hospital alone, she carried flowers from the gift shop and wore the careful expression she used when she wanted to appear gentle before asking for something cruel. "I spoke with Madison," she said, placing the flowers on the windowsill. "She's devastated." I was sitting upright in bed, still weak, still on oxygen, with a sore throat and a deep ache in my chest. Dr. Grant had increased my monitoring through the night. Every nurse who came in checked my oxygen levels with a seriousness that made it impossible to pretend yesterday had been small. "Is she sorry?" I asked. Mom's face tightened. "She's shaken. That should tell you something." "It tells me she's scared there will be consequences." "Hannah, don't do this." I turned my head toward her. "Do what?" "Turn one terrible moment into a weapon against your sister." For a few seconds, I could only stare at her. Madison had put her hand on a medical device I needed to breathe, yanked it away, and left me gasping in a hospital bed. Yet somehow, I was the one holding a weapon. Mom sat in the chair beside me and lowered her voice. Dr. Grant documented the incident very harshly. "Your sister could be banned from visiting. There could be legal complications. Your grandfather could hear a version that makes everything worse." "A version?" I said. "He would hear what happened." She panicked. She pulled out my oxygen tube. "She is young, Hannah." "She's 26. Mom looked away, frustrated that age did not help her argument. Then she opened her purse and pulled out a folded paper. "The hospital needs clarity. I think it would be best if you made a short statement saying there was confusion, that Madison did not intend to harm you, and that you don't want the matter taken further." I looked at the paper but did not touch it. "You brought me a statement?" I wrote down something simple. "You can adjust the wording." The room seemed to shrink around me. This was not an apology. It was a cleanup. Mom had not come to ask how I felt. She had come to make sure my pain did not become evidence. "No," I said. Her expression hardened. "Think carefully. Once something is written into a medical record, it can follow people." "It should follow her." "Hannah." "No, I am not signing anything." Mom stood too quickly, the chair scraping against the floor. "You have always known how to make things bigger than they need to be." I felt the old instinct rise, the urge to soften my tone, to explain that I was not trying to hurt anyone, but I was too tired to rescue her from the truth. She could have seriously hurt me. "And she has cried all night because of it." I looked at the oxygen tube resting beneath my nose. I struggled to breathe because of it. Mom's eyes filled, but not with the kind of grief I needed. It was anger wearing sadness. "I don't know when you became so cold." Before I could answer, Dr. Grant entered with my chart. He glanced at my mother, then at the folded paper on the blanket between us. His face did not change, but his voice became very still. "Mrs. Reed, are you asking my patient to alter her account of a documented medical incident?" Mom lifted her chin. "I'm asking my daughter not to destroy her sister's life over a mistake." Dr. Grant stepped closer to the bed. "A patient recovering from surgery was deprived of prescribed oxygen. That is not a family disagreement. She didn't mean to hurt her. Intent does not erase risk." Mom picked up the paper and shoved it back into her purse. "Doctors see everything as liability." "I see a patient who needs rest," he said. "If your visit is causing distress, it needs to end." For once, my mother had no sentence ready. She gave me one last wounded look, as if I had betrayed her by letting someone else protect me, then left without saying goodbye. After she was gone, Dr. Grant checked the monitor and adjusted the chart at the foot of my bed. "Has anyone pressured you to describe the incident differently?" I hesitated. The habit of protecting my family was still there, even after everything. But Grandpa's words came back to me. "Preserve your own truth." "Yes," I said. Dr. Grant nodded, not surprised. "I'm going to note that." A strange fear moved through me. "Will that make things worse?" "It may make them angrier," he said. "That is not the same as worse." That afternoon, my phone filled with messages. Mom sent long paragraphs about forgiveness, family, and how Madison had always been emotionally fragile. An aunt wrote that hospitals were stressful and people sometimes reacted badly. A cousin said, I should not let one dramatic moment divide the family. None of them asked what it felt like when the air disappeared. None of them asked whether I was afraid. Madison waited until evening. Her message was short. "You're really enjoying this, aren't you?" I stared at the screen until it blurred. A minute later, another message appeared. "Grandpa won't protect you forever." That was the first one I saved. Then I saved the next, and the next after that. Madison called me selfish, manipulative, disgusting. She said if I had not been performing, none of this would have happened. She said Mom was the only one who saw through me. Each message felt like a bruise, but I saved them all. When Grandpa called that night, I almost did not answer. I knew he would hear the weakness in my voice, and I hated giving my family another reason to call me fragile, but he had never used my pain against me. "Hannah," he said when I picked up, "tell me the truth." So I did. I told him about Madison's hand on the tube, about Mom holding her while I gasped, about the statement she wanted me to sign. Grandpa did not interrupt. The silence on the other end was heavy, controlled, and more frightening than shouting. Finally, he said, "Did Dr. Grant document it?" "Yes." "Good." That one word almost broke me. Not because it was warm, but because it meant I was not crazy. Someone believed the record mattered. Someone believed I mattered. "I don't want a war," I whispered. "You are not starting one," Grandpa said. "You are refusing to disappear inside their lie." The next day, hospital security informed my mother that Madison could not visit without approval. Mom called me immediately, furious. "Do you understand what you've done? Your sister feels like a criminal." She acted like one. The line went silent. I had never said anything like that before. When Mom spoke again, her voice was low. "Be careful, Hannah. One day you may need this family." I almost laughed, but it came out as a painful breath. "I needed you yesterday." She hung up. Dr. Grant discharged me 2 days later with strict instructions: rest, medication, limited visitors, follow-up appointments, and continued oxygen support at home when needed. Grandpa wanted me to stay in one of his guest suites with a private nurse, but Mom insisted that would send the wrong message. For the first time, I did not ask what message she meant. I accepted Grandpa's help. Before I left the hospital, Dr. Grant handed me copies of my discharge summary and the incident note. "Keep your own records," he said. "Do not rely on anyone else to preserve them for you." I placed the folder carefully in my bag beside Madison's messages. At Grandpa's house, recovery was quiet. A nurse came twice a day. Grandpa checked on me without hovering. He did not ask me to forgive anyone, and he did not tell me to be stronger. He only told me to heal. For 3 days, I almost believed the worst had passed. Then, on the 4th morning, I woke to voices downstairs. Grandpa's assistant was crying. The nurse stood in the doorway of my room, pale and hesitant. "What happened?" I asked. She looked at me with the kind of pity people show when they are about to break something that cannot be repaired. "Miss Reed," she said softly, "your grandfather passed away early this morning." For a moment, the room was silent. Then the grief hit, sharp and total. The only person in my family who had seen the truth clearly was gone, and somewhere across town, I knew my mother and Madison were already thinking the same thing. Now, no one can protect Hannah. Grandpa's funeral was held 3 days later, in a chapel filled with white flowers, polished wood, and people who spoke about him as if they had all understood him. They talked about his generosity, his discipline, his vision for the family foundation. They praised the company he built, the clinics he funded, the scholarships he created. I sat in the front row with an oxygen cannula hidden as discreetly as possible beneath my hair, listening to strangers describe the man who had been, in the final months of his life, the only person who refused to let my family rename cruelty as love. My body was still weak from surgery. The nurse had warned me not to overdo it, and Dr. Grant had advised against a TI. But staying away felt impossible. Grandpa had shown up for me when it mattered. I could not let him be buried while Madison stood beside my mother and pretended to be the granddaughter who had loved him best. Madison arrived in a black dress that looked expensive enough to be noticed, but modest enough to be praised. Her eyes were red, though I did not know whether she had cried for Grandpa or for the inheritance she expected to receive. She clung to Mom's arm as guests approached, accepting condolences in a fragile voice. Every few minutes, Mom touched her back or whispered something near her ear, as if Madison were the one barely holding herself together. When I entered, several relatives looked at me with the cautious curiosity people reserve for family scandals they have only heard in fragments. Aunt Carol kissed my cheek and said, "You poor thing. Hospitals can make everyone emotional." Another cousin told me, "I hope you and Madison can heal from all this." Not one of them asked what had actually happened. Madison's version had already reached them first, softened into something harmless enough to defend. She had been frightened. I had been harsh. The whole thing had been blown out of proportion. Mom found me near the side aisle before the service began. She wore a perfect black suit and the expression of a woman determined to control the room. "You should sit quietly today," she said. I looked at her. "I came to bury Grandpa. And I am asking you not to turn his funeral into a scene." A bitter laugh rose in my throat, but I swallowed it because breathing still hurt. "I haven't said anything." "You don't have to say anything to make people uncomfortable," she replied. "Everyone knows there was tension at the hospital. Madison is devastated, and today is not the day to punish her." "Punish her?" I repeated. Mom lowered her voice. "Do not mention the oxygen tube. Do not mention Dr. Grant. Do not make your grandfather's funeral about your resentment." I stared at her, waiting for some part of her to realize what she had just said. She did not. In her mind, the danger Madison caused had already become my resentment, my drama, my threat to family dignity. Before I could answer, Madison appeared beside her. She looked at me with wet eyes and reached out as if to hug me. "Hannah," she whispered, loud enough for nearby relatives to hear. "I know things have been hard, but I don't want us to fight today." Her arms closed around me before I could step back. The embrace was light, careful, public. To everyone watching, it probably looked like a grieving younger sister reaching for peace. But near my ear, Madison whispered, "Don't embarrass yourself." Then she pulled away with tears on her face. Mom immediately wrapped an arm around her. A few relatives softened at the sight. I stood there, too tired to defend myself against a performance so well rehearsed. Grandpa had once told me that Madison did not simply lie. She built rooms where everyone else felt safer believing her. At his funeral, I finally understood exactly what he meant. The service began. Mom gave a speech about family loyalty and the importance of carrying Grandpa's legacy with grace. Madison cried through most of it, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. When it was my turn to speak, Mom's eyes warned me from the front row. I walked to the lectern slowly, one hand resting against my ribs, and looked out at the chapel. I did not mention the hospital. I did not mention Madison. I spoke about Grandpa's habit of reading every line before signing anything. I spoke about the way he cared more about a small clinic doing real work than a gala with perfect lighting. I said he believed truth was not always loud, but it had to be protected. My voice shook on the last sentence, and for a moment, I had to stop. He taught me, I said, that being strong should never mean accepting harm in silence. The chapel went still. Mom's face hardened. Madison looked down at her hands. I returned to my seat, knowing I had said enough for the people who understood, and too much for the people who feared the meaning. After the burial, the family gathered at Mom's house. Food covered the dining table. Guests murmured in small groups. Madison moved through the rooms with the graceful sadness of someone aware she was being watched. I stayed mostly near the library, away from the crowd, trying to conserve my strength. That was where Grandpa's attorney, Mr. Alden, found me. He was an older man with silver-rimmed glasses and a careful manner. "Miss Reed," he said quietly, "your grandfather left something for you." My heart tightened. "For me?" He handed me a sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in Grandpa's firm, familiar handwriting. For a few seconds, I could not open it. The sight of those letters hurt more than the funeral had. Mr. Alden lowered his voice. He asked that you read it before the will reading. "When is that?" "Tomorrow afternoon. My office. All named parties have been notified." I nodded, still holding the envelope. He hesitated, then added, "There is one more thing. Dr. Elias Grant has been formally requested to attend." I looked up. "Dr. Grant? Why?" "Your grandfather included a medical witness provision in the final instructions." The word sent a chill through me. Medical witness. Grandpa had not been speaking in vague warnings. He had prepared for something specific, something he feared my family would try to bury. Across the room, Madison noticed us speaking. Her eyes moved from Mr. Alden to the envelope in my hand. Within seconds, she was beside Mom, whispering urgently. Mom looked over at me, and for the first time since Grandpa's death, I saw something crack beneath her control. Not grief, fear. I slipped into the library and closed the door behind me. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. "Hannah, if you are reading this, then I am no longer able to say these things aloud. I know your first instinct will be to keep peace, even when peace demands your silence. Do not. There are people in this family who have mistaken your endurance for permission. I should have stopped it sooner. What happened to you was not your fault. What they ask you to forgive is not always something they have the right to demand. Tomorrow, let the documents speak. Let the doctor speak. Most of all, do not let your mother turn your pain into Madison's excuse. You were never too dramatic. You were never too difficult. You were the only one telling the truth in a house that punished you for it. Grandpa." I read the letter twice, then held it against my chest and cried without trying to stop myself. For once, the tears did not feel like weakness. They felt like proof that someone had seen me before it was too late. When I returned to the hall, Mom was waiting near the staircase. Her voice was low and sharp. "What did he give you?" "A letter." Her eyes narrowed. "About what?" "Me." Madison stood behind her, arms crossed, her grief gone from her face now that there was no audience close enough to admire it. "Grandpa was confused at the end," she said. "You know that, right?" I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in my bag. No, Madison. I think he was finally clear. Mom stepped closer. Tomorrow is going to be emotional. Whatever you think that letter means, do not walk into that office trying to hurt your sister. For the first time, I did not lower my eyes. I'm not the one who hurt her. Mom's face tightened, but she said nothing. Maybe because we both knew the next room where truth would be spoken would not be her dining room, her hallway, or her carefully managed funeral. It would be an attorney's office, with documents she could not interrupt, and a doctor she could not shame into silence. That night, I slept with Grandpa's letter beside me and woke before dawn, already afraid. But beneath the fear was something steadier. Tomorrow, Madison would cry. Mom would defend her. Relatives would look at me as if I were the problem. Only this time, Grandpa had made sure I would not be the only one in the room carrying the truth. By the time the house emptied after the funeral reception, my mother's grief had hardened into strategy. The relatives left with covered plates and sympathetic looks. Madison disappeared upstairs, then came down again in a silk robe, as if the day had exhausted her more than anyone else. I stayed in the library with Grandpa's letter folded inside my bag, feeling its presence like a hand on my shoulder. Mom entered without knocking. She closed the door behind her and stood near Grandpa's old desk. We need to talk about tomorrow. I already knew what kind of conversation this would be. About the will reading? About your attitude at the will reading, she said. Your grandfather made decisions when he was tired, grieving his own health, and clearly influenced by people around him. People like Dr. Grant? Her jaw tightened. That doctor has no place in a private family matter. Grandpa requested him. Your grandfather was old. Her voice softened in the way it always did, before she tried to make control sound like concern. Hannah, I know you're hurting. I know the hospital frightened you, but if you go into that room tomorrow determined to punish Madison, you will regret it. I looked at her for a long moment. Madison pulled out my oxygen tube. Mom closed her eyes as if I had said something vulgar. She panicked. She was angry. She was scared. She was jealous. Mom's eyes snapped open. Enough. You don't know what your sister feels. That almost made me laugh. My whole life had been built around what Madison felt. Her sadness changed dinner plans. Her jealousy hid my achievements. Her embarrassment became my apology. If anyone in that house had been trained to understand Madison's feelings, it was me. I know what she did, I said. Mom stepped closer. What happened in that hospital room should stay in that hospital room. Tomorrow is about family legacy, not revenge. No, I said quietly. Tomorrow is about truth. For the first time, my mother looked genuinely afraid. It passed quickly, replaced by anger, but I saw it. She was not afraid that I would lie. She was afraid that I would finally stop helping her lie. Madison came in a few minutes later, eyes red but dry. Without an audience, she did not bother pretending to be fragile. So this is it? She asked. You're going to let Grandpa's lawyer and that doctor humiliate me because of one mistake? One mistake? I repeated. You're alive, aren't you? The words landed with a cold finality. Even my mother flinched, but she still did not rebuke her. Madison noticed and became bolder. You act like I tried to kill you, she said. I pulled a tube. For a few seconds, you made it into some huge medical drama because that's what you do. My hand tightened around the strap of my bag. Dr. Grant documented what happened. Of course he did. He's on your side. He's a doctor, Madison. He's Grandpa's doctor, she snapped. And tomorrow he'll stand there making me look unstable so you can take everything. There it was, finally said plainly. This had never been only about illness. It was inheritance, position, and fear. Madison believed anything Grandpa gave me was something stolen from her. She had lived so long as the protected daughter that fairness felt like theft. Mom stepped between us before I could answer. No one is taking everything. Your grandfather loved both of you. Then why is Dr. Grant coming? Madison demanded. Why did Mr. Alden tell Mom there's a medical witness provision? Why did Grandpa leave Hannah a letter and not me? Madison demanded. Mom's silence answered more than she meant it to. I looked at them both and understood something I had missed before. They did not know the contents of the will, but they knew enough to be scared. Grandpa had warned them somehow, or Mr. Alden's formal notice had revealed more than they expected. Their confidence at the funeral had been a mask. Beneath it, they were calculating. Madison's voice dropped. You can still fix this. I stared at her. Fix what? Tell the doctor not to come. Tell Mr. Alden you don't want the hospital incident discussed. Tell them I didn't mean anything. Mom added quickly. It would show maturity, Hannah. It would show respect for your grandfather's memory. Grandpa asked Dr. Grant to be there. He is dead, Madison said. You can stop hiding behind him now. The room went still. My mother whispered Madison's name, but the damage was already done. For a second, I saw Madison clearly, stripped of the tears and excuses. She was not a frightened little sister. She was a woman furious that the one person who had protected me could still speak through documents she could not manipulate. I stood. My legs were unsteady, but my voice was not. I'm going to the will reading tomorrow. I'm not calling Dr. Grant. I'm not changing my statement. And I'm not signing anything that makes what you did smaller. Madison's face twisted. You're going to regret this. Maybe, I said. But not as much as I regret protecting you all these years. I left the library before either of them could answer. Upstairs, in the guest room Grandpa had insisted I use during recovery, I locked the door and took out the folder Dr. Grant had given me. You was there, along with the incident note and copies of Madison's messages. I read them once, not because I needed to remember, but because I needed to stop doubting myself. The words were clear. Oxygen displacement. Patient distress. Visitor present. It was strange how clinical language could feel more merciful than family language. It did not comfort Madison. It did not accuse me. It simply recorded what happened. My phone buzzed near midnight. A message from Madison appeared. Last chance. Don't make me look bad tomorrow. A second message followed. Grandpa only felt sorry for you because you made yourself pathetic. Then a third. If I lose anything because of you, I swear you'll pay for it. I saved every message and placed the phone face down on the bed. My hands were shaking, but not from weakness this time. For years, I had been afraid of Madison's anger, because anger meant Mom would demand I repair the damage. But now her anger was evidence. Her threats were evidence. Her confidence that I should protect her was evidence. The next morning, Mr. Alden called to confirm the time. His voice was professional, but gentler than usual. Miss Reed, I want you to know Dr. Grant has confirmed his attendance. Does my mother know? All named parties received the same notice. I closed my eyes. Then they know. Yes, he said, and I should advise you that the final document contains provisions that may cause strong reactions. I looked at Grandpa's letter on the nightstand. I expected that. There will be security at the office, Mr. Alden added. That detail told me more than any explanation could. Grandpa had not merely prepared a will, he had anticipated conflict. He had known exactly what my mother and Madison might do when truth threatened inheritance. At noon, Mom's driver took us to Mr. Alden's office. The ride was silent, except for Madison's occasional sniffles, which she resumed the moment we left the house. She wore a black dress again, pearls at her throat, her hair pinned softly around her face. To anyone else, she looked like a grieving granddaughter. To me, she looked like someone preparing for a role. Mom sat beside her, holding her hand. She did not look at me once. Mr. Alden's office occupied the 7th floor of an old stone building downtown. When we arrived, several relatives were already in the conference room. Aunt Carol, Uncle James, 2 cousins, and a family accountant. They greeted Madison first. She accepted their sympathy with a trembling smile. I sat near the end of the table, placing my medical folder beside my bag, and tried to breathe slowly. At exactly 1 o'clock, Dr. Grant entered. The room changed. Madison's fingers tightened around Mom's hand. Mom's face went pale, then controlled again. Dr. Grant greeted Mr. Alden, then nodded to me without warmth or performance, only steady acknowledgement. He took a seat along the wall, not beside me, which somehow made his presence more powerful. He was not there as my ally in a family argument. He was there as a witness. Madison leaned toward Mom and whispered, "Why is he sitting in?" Mr. Alden heard her. He opened the leather folder in front of him and said, "Because Mr. Arthur Reed required it." Then he looked around the table. "Before we begin reading the distribution of assets, there are several conditions attached to this will. Mr. Reed was very clear that those conditions must be addressed first." My mother sat straighter. Madison stopped crying. I felt Grandpa's letter inside my bag, and for the first time since his death, I did not feel alone. Tomorrow had arrived, and the room where my family usually rewrote the truth was not theirs anymore. Mr. Alden did not begin with money. That alone unsettled the room. In our family, death had always been discussed in softened language, but inheritance was handled with sharp attention. Even the relatives who pretended to be there for respect leaned forward when he opened Grandpa's leather folder. Madison sat beside Mom with her hands folded neatly on the table, still wearing the expression of a wounded granddaughter. But when Mr. Alden mentioned conditions before assets, her face changed. These conditions were written and signed by Mr. Arthur Reed 6 weeks before his passing, Mr. Alden said. They were reviewed by 2 witnesses and reaffirmed 1 week later. There was no question regarding his mental clarity at the time of signing. Mom's lips tightened. "Why would you need to say that first?" "Because Mr. Reed instructed me to," Mr. Alden replied. Aunt Carol shifted in her chair. Uncle James glanced at Mom, then at Madison. No one spoke. Dr. Grant remained seated along the wall, calm and unreadable, his hands folded over a thin medical file. He did not look like a man involved in family drama. He looked like a man waiting for facts to be requested. Mr. Alden adjusted his glasses and continued. Mr. Reed added what he called a conduct clause. Any named beneficiary who knowingly caused harm to another beneficiary, attempted to conceal harm, pressured a victim to alter their account, or used family influence to interfere with medical or legal documentation would be subject to forfeiture. The room went very still. Madison's fingers tightened around Mom's hand. Mom's voice came out controlled, but strained. "That sounds extreme. My father would never want his family turned against each other over vague accusations." Mr. Alden looked at her directly. "The clause is not based on vague accusations." Madison swallowed. "Is this about the hospital?" No one had said it. She had. Mr. Alden did not answer immediately. That silence did more damage than a yes. Madison looked at Mom as if expecting rescue, but Mom was staring at the folder on the table, calculating how much of this could still be controlled. "This is a will reading," Mom said, "not a courtroom." "No," Mr. Alden agreed. But Mr. Reed anticipated that certain events might be minimized if left only to family discussion. That is why he required independent documentation. I felt my pulse in my throat. My medical folder sat beside my bag, untouched. I had brought it because I was afraid no one would believe me. Now I realized Grandpa had never intended to leave the truth, resting only in my hands. Mr. Alden began with the smaller distributions. Aunt Carol received a trust payment for her grandchildren's education. Uncle James received a percentage of a property investment he had helped manage years earlier. 2 longtime employees of Reed Holdings were given generous retirement bonuses. The family foundation received a protected endowment, with instructions that medical clinics serving low-income patients be prioritized for the next 5 years. For a few minutes, the room returned to familiar ground. Names, amounts, properties, percentages. Madison relaxed slightly when she heard her name mentioned. She was given jewelry from Grandpa's late wife, a small cash inheritance, and the right to purchase one of the family's vacation vehicles at a reduced value. Her expression flickered. It was not nothing, but it was far less than she had expected. Mom noticed too. Is that all for Madison? Mr. Alden did not look up. I have not finished. Madison's shoulders eased again. Hope returned to her face, thin and greedy. She was waiting for the real prize, the lake house. She had always called, basically mine, a position connected to the foundation, and enough money to keep living as if consequences belonged to other people. Then Mr. Alden read my mother's portion. She received a fixed annual allowance from a family trust, but not control of the trust itself. She received the right to remain in her current home for 2 years, provided she did not attempt to sell, leverage, or transfer assets tied to the Reed estate. The words landed like stones. Mom sat perfectly still, but color drained from her face. That cannot be right, she said. Mr. Alden continued. Mr. Reed removed you as trustee of the family foundation and the primary estate trust. A low murmur passed through the room. Mom straightened, wounded pride breaking through her composure. My father trusted me with this family for decades. Mr. Alden's voice stayed even. His final documents indicate that he no longer believed family authority should rest with someone who confused loyalty with concealment. Madison turned sharply toward me. You did this. I had not said a word. Mom squeezed her hand hard enough to silence her, but the accusation had already shown the room what Madison feared. She did not ask what Grandpa meant. She assumed the loss had something to do with me. Mr. Alden turned the page. The lake house, the voting shares attached to Reed Holdings, and administrative authority over the medical portion of the foundation are assigned to Hannah Reed, subject to the final conduct review included in this document. For a moment, I did not understand. The words were too large, too formal, too impossible. I had expected Grandpa to protect me somehow. I had not expected him to place real power in my hands. Madison pushed back from the table. No, absolutely not. Mom's voice shook. My father would not give Hannah control over assets she is too ill to manage. The sentence hung there, ugly and revealing. Not too inexperienced, not unqualified, too ill. Even now, my sickness was the tool she reached for when she needed to take something from me. Dr. Grant looked up for the first time. Mr. Alden noticed. That brings us to the required medical review. Mom stood. I object to this. This is not a proceeding where you may object, Mr. Alden said. You may contest the will later through appropriate legal channels. Today, I am carrying out Mr. Reed's instructions. Madison's voice cracked. Why does he get to talk? He doesn't know our family. Dr. Grant rose slowly. No, I know the medical record. That silenced her. Mr. Alden handed him a page. Dr. Grant, Mr. Reed requested that you confirm whether Hannah Reed's diagnosis, surgery, oxygen support, and the documented hospital incident were medically legitimate. Mom's face hardened. This is humiliating. Dr. Grant did not look at her. The patient's diagnosis was legitimate. The procedure was necessary. The oxygen support after surgery was prescribed and medically required. Removing it created immediate distress and measurable risk. Madison shook her head. I didn't know. You were told not to interfere with medical equipment, Dr. Grant said. I was scared. Mr. Alden turned another page. Mr. Reed also requested review of communications submitted after the incident. My stomach tightened. Madison's messages. The threats, the accusations, the words she had sent because she still believed I would keep protecting her. Mom looked at me then, and for the first time that day, I saw not just anger but betrayal. Not because Madison had sent the messages, because I had saved them. Mr. Alden read only a few lines aloud. Enough. Madison calling me pathetic. Madison saying Grandpa only pitied me. Madison warning me not to make her look bad. Madison writing that if she lost anything because of me, I would pay for it. With each sentence, her public grief dissolved. The relatives who had comforted her at the funeral began looking away. Madison stood abruptly. She provoked me. She always does this. She makes herself the victim, Then everyone acts like I'm some monster. Dr. Grant closed the file. Miss Reed, the question is not whether you felt provoked. The question is whether fear explains what happened. Madison's face went pale. Mr. Alden nodded once. Dr. Grant, Mr. Reed asked you to give your professional conclusion before the conduct clause is applied. The room seemed to shrink around the table. Mom reached for Madison, but Madison did not move. For once, there was no hallway to run into, no bedroom door to slam, no mother's arms large enough to cover the record. Dr. Grant stepped forward. He stopped beside Madison, close enough that she flinched when he gently touched her shoulder, not with comfort, but with the grave formality of someone about to end a lie. Then he looked across the table and prepared to say the 6 words Grandpa had made sure everyone would hear. Dr. Grant's hand rested on Madison's shoulder for only a second, but it was enough to make her flinch. She looked up at him with wide eyes, trying to summon the fragile expression that had saved her so many times before. In my mother's house, that face could stop any argument. In this room, with legal papers on the table and medical records open in front of everyone, it had nowhere to go. Dr. Grant looked at Mr. Alden, then at the rest of the family. His voice was calm, clear, and impossible to soften. She wasn't scared. She planned this. The room went silent. Madison pulled away from his hand, as if burned. That's a lie. Dr. Grant did not react to the accusation. Before the incident, you repeatedly stated that Hannah was exaggerating her condition. You questioned the need for oxygen support after being told it was medically required. You approached the equipment after being instructed not to interfere with anything near the patient's bed. Then, when the tube was removed, you did not attempt to replace it or call for help. I froze, Madison said. People freeze when they panic. You did not freeze before the incident, Dr. Grant replied. You challenged her to remove the oxygen support to prove she was not performing. Aunt Carol's hand flew to her mouth. Uncle James stared at Madison as if seeing her for the first time. My mother stood halfway from her chair, pale with anger. This is outrageous, Mom said. You are making assumptions about my daughter's state of mind. Mr. Alden opened another section of the folder. That is why Mr. Reed requested supporting communications be reviewed. Madison's face changed. For one moment, she looked directly at me, and I saw the exact second she understood. The messages she had sent because she thought I would stay silent were no longer private weapons. They were evidence. Mr. Alden read in a measured voice, giving each line enough space to land. You won't keep fooling everyone forever. He turned a page. Don't make me look bad tomorrow. Another page. If I lose anything because of you, I swear you'll pay for it. Madison's mouth opened, but no words came out. Mom turned toward me. You saved those? The question revealed everything. She was not horrified by the threats. She was horrified that I had kept proof. Yes, I said. Her eyes hardened. After everything this family has done for you? Grandpa's attorney cut in before I could answer. Mrs. Reed, Mr. Arthur Reed, anticipated this response as well. Mom went still. Mr. Alden lifted a sealed page from the folder. He added a written statement to be read only if the conduct clause became relevant. He unfolded the paper. The room seemed to hold its breath. My family may attempt to call cruelty a misunderstanding, pressure loyalty from the injured, or mistake silence for peace. I reject that. A person who harms another and then demands protection from consequences is not fragile. A person who covers that harm is not loyal. I built my estate to support responsibility, not entitlement. Madison began crying again, but this time the sound felt smaller. No one moved to comfort her. Not even Mom, whose hand hovered in the air but did not quite reach her. Mr. Alden continued. The conduct clause applies to Madison Reed for direct interference with medically required oxygen support, subsequent threats, and attempts to minimize the incident. It also applies in part to Vivian Reed for pressuring Hannah Reed to alter her account and for attempting to prevent documentation from affecting estate decisions. Mom's chair scraped back. You cannot do this. I am not doing it, Mr. Alden said. Your father did. Madison shook her head violently. Grandpa loved me. He did, Mr. Alden said. That is why the original will included a larger provision for you. That provision was revoked after the hospital incident and after Mr. Reed received confirmation that Hannah had been pressured to change her statement. Madison turned on me. You told him? He asked me what happened, I said. I told him the truth. You ruined my life. For once, my voice did not shake. No, Madison. You finally ran out of people willing to hide what you did. The words seemed to hit harder than I expected. Her face twisted with rage, but she had no useful tears left. The room had seen too much. The relatives who had accepted her funeral performance now looked at the table, the walls, anywhere except at her. Mr. Alden returned to the will. Madison Reed is removed from all discretionary inheritance beyond the minor items already listed. She will not receive the lake house, trust distributions, foundation position, or voting shares. Vivian Reed is removed as trustee, estate administrator, and foundation authority. Her personal allowance remains, but all management rights are revoked. Mom looked as if the floor had moved beneath her. My own father would not leave me powerless. Dr. Grant spoke quietly. He left power away from anyone willing to pressure a recovering patient into silence. Mom turned on him. You had no right to involve yourself in our family. My patient was harmed in a hospital room, he said. Your family made it my responsibility when you tried to call that harm an inconvenience. The final distribution came next. Mr. Alden read that the lake house, a controlling portion of the family trust, and administrative authority over the medical clinic fund would pass to me. I could not speak. I had expected protection, perhaps a letter, perhaps proof. I had not expected Grandpa to hand me the very tools my mother had always used to control the family. Madison stood suddenly. She can't manage that. She's sick. There it was again. The same excuse, dressed as concern. My mother did not stop her. Mr. Alden looked at me. Mr. Reed addressed that too. Hannah Reed's medical condition does not invalidate her authority. Temporary support may be arranged during recovery, but no beneficiary may use her illness to contest her competence without independent legal and medical review. Madison's face collapsed into panic. Mom, say something. Mom opened her mouth, but nothing came out that could help. For the first time, she had no room to translate Madison's actions into innocence. Grandpa had taken away the language she used to protect her favorite daughter. Mr. Alden closed the folder halfway. There is also a referral packet prepared for counsel regarding the hospital incident. Hannah may choose whether to pursue civil action. The hospital may proceed according to its own policies. Madison whispered, You wouldn't. I looked at her, remembering the tube in her hand, my mother's arms around her, and the sound of my own breath failing. I don't know yet. That answer terrified her more than a threat. It meant I was no longer promising to save her. The meeting ended in fragments. Aunt Carol left without hugging Madison. Uncle James muttered that he needed air. The accountant gathered his papers with shaking hands. Mom remained seated, staring at the closed will as if she could still force it to become the document she wanted. Madison came toward me, only when she realized no one else was coming to her defense. Her voice dropped into the old pleading tone. Hannah, please. You know I didn't mean for it to go this far. I stood slowly, careful of the pull in my chest. That's the problem, Madison. You never think anything should go as far as consequences. Her eyes filled again. I'm your sister. And I was your sister when you took away my oxygen. She stepped back as if I had struck her. Mom finally rose, anger and desperation fighting across her face. You are enjoying this. I looked at her, and for the first time, I did not need her to understand me. No, I'm surviving it. Dr. Grant opened the conference room door for me. As I walked out, I heard Madison begin to sob behind me, louder now, almost frantic. Once, that sound would have pulled me back. Once, I would have apologized just to make it stop. This time, I kept walking. I did not go back to my mother's house after the will reading. Dr. Grant insisted I should not be alone that afternoon, and Mr. Alden arranged for a car to take me back to Grandpa's guest suite, where the nurse was already waiting. I sat in the back seat with Grandpa's letter in my bag, and the weight of his will still pressing against my chest. I had won, if that was the right word for it. Madison had been exposed. Mom had lost control of the estate, and the truth had finally been spoken in a room where no one could shout it down. But victory did not feel loud. It felt quiet, heavy, and almost impossible to trust. By evening, my phone began to fill with calls. Madison called first, then Mom, then Madison again. I watched their names light up the screen until the missed calls became a list. For years, those calls would have pulled me back into the old pattern. I would have answered, listened, softened, explained, and eventually apologized for the discomfort my pain had caused them. This time, I turned the phone over and let it ring. The next morning, Mr. Alden came to the house with documents that needed my signature. Grandpa had left detailed instructions, not just about assets, but about protection. The lake house would transfer into a trust under my control. The medical clinic fund would continue operating with a professional board, and I would have final approval over major grants after my recovery. My mother could not access the accounts, alter the foundation's direction, or use the family home as leverage. Grandpa had not simply given me money. He had removed the weapons my mother had used for years. "What happens to Madison now?" I asked. Mr. Alden folded his hands. "She has lost her inheritance beyond the minor items already listed. The hospital has its own report. Dr. Grant's documentation is clear. If you choose to pursue civil action, the evidence is strong." I looked toward the window. Outside, the garden was wet from morning rain. "And if I don't? That is your decision," he said. "But doing nothing for your own peace is different from doing nothing to protect her." That sentence stayed with me. I had been taught that mercy meant removing consequences. Grandpa, Dr. Grant, and now Mr. Alden were teaching me something else. Mercy could also mean refusing to become cruel while still allowing the truth to stand. I chose not to make a public spectacle of Madison, but I did not erase what she had done. The hospital banned her from visiting any patient without clearance. Dr. Grant filed the required internal report. Mr. Alden sent a formal notice warning Madison that any further threats or harassment would be met with legal action. For once, my sister was not rescued from the record. Her name stayed attached to her actions. Madison did not accept that quietly. She sent long messages at first, then desperate ones. She said I had destroyed her future. She said Grandpa had been manipulated. She said I was selfish for taking the lake house, cruel for letting the hospital report stand, and jealous for refusing to move on. Then, when anger failed, she tried apology. "I'm sorry you felt scared." That was the first version. I didn't know it was serious. That was the second. "You know I would never actually hurt you." That was the third. I did not answer any of them. An apology that still protected the lie was not an apology. It was another attempt to make me carry the weight for both of us. Mom came 3 days later. The nurse almost did not let her in, but I agreed to speak with her in the sitting room, with the door open. She looked smaller than she had at the attorney's office, though not softer. Her face was pale, her eyes tired, and for the first time in my life, she entered a room I controlled. "Hannah," she said, "this has gone too far." I sat across from her, oxygen support resting beside me in case I needed it. "No, it finally went far enough." Her mouth tightened. "Madison is falling apart." I nearly did too. She made a mistake. She made a choice. Mom looked toward the doorway, as if hoping someone would interrupt before she had to answer. No one did. "You have to understand, your sister has always needed more care. And you decided that meant I needed less." The words were calm, but they changed the room. Mom stared at me, as if I had spoken a language she had spent years refusing to learn. "I loved you both," she said. "Maybe," I replied. "But you only protected one of us." Her eyes filled. Once, that would have broken me. I would have rushed to comfort her, because a crying mother was still a mother, and I had wanted mine for so long. But now, I could see the difference between grief and accountability. She was grieving the loss of control, the loss of reputation, the loss of the daughter who used to make everything easier by swallowing the truth. "I came to ask you not to press charges," she said. There it was. Not forgiveness, not remorse, a request. "I haven't decided what I'll do legally," I said. "But I won't change the record. I won't call it an accident. I won't say Madison was just scared." Mom's face hardened. "So you want revenge?" "No," I said. "I want a life where I don't have to pretend harm is love." She looked away first. Before she left, she tried one final time. "One day, when you're older, you'll regret turning your back on family." I stood slowly. My chest still ached, but my voice was steady. "I spent my whole life waiting for you to choose me once. Today, I'm choosing myself." Mom did not answer. She walked out with her shoulders stiff, and I watched her go without calling her back. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were mine. Recovery came in small victories. Walking across the room without stopping, sleeping through the night without panic, breathing without listening for someone else's judgment. Dr. Grant monitored my progress and reminded me that healing was not proof I had exaggerated the pain. Mr. Alden helped me form a new advisory board for the Foundation's medical fund. The first grant I approved went to the respiratory clinic that had treated me, expanding support for patients recovering from surgery without family care. At the first board meeting, I sat at the head of the table Grandpa had once occupied. I expected to feel like an imposter. Instead, I felt sad, grateful, and steady. Grandpa had trusted me, not because I was the loudest, richest, or most charming, but because I knew what it meant to be unseen. That made me careful with power. Madison eventually lost more than money. Her fiancé ended their engagement after the attorney's notice and hospital report became impossible to explain away. Several family friends stopped returning her calls. Without Mom's access to the estate, her lifestyle shrank quickly. She still cried, I heard. She still told people I had ruined her, but fewer people believed her now. Mom moved out of the family house 6 months later, when the trust terms required it. She left without speaking to me directly. Aunt Carol told me she blamed everyone except herself, which did not surprise me. Accountability is hardest for people who spend their lives renaming it cruelty. I went to the lake house alone at the beginning of spring. It had been Grandpa's favorite place, a quiet property surrounded by pines and cold blue water. Madison had once talked about turning it into a party retreat. Mom had assumed she would manage it. Grandpa left it to me with one instruction: make it a place where silence is peaceful, not forced. I stood on the porch with his letter in my hand and read the final lines again. "You were never too dramatic. You were never too difficult. You were the only one telling the truth in a house that punished you for it." For the first time, I believed him without needing anyone else to agree. I did not get the mother I had wanted. I did not get the sister I had protected. I did not get back the years I spent shrinking so Madison could feel large. But I got my breath back. I got my name back. I got the truth written clearly enough that no one could fold it into an excuse. People think revenge is always loud. They imagine shouting, destruction, and someone begging on the floor. But sometimes revenge is quieter than that. Sometimes it is signing the papers, keeping the records, blocking the calls, funding the clinic, and letting people live with the consequences they spent years avoiding. Madison took my oxygen for a few seconds. My mother asked me to forgive her for it forever. Grandpa made sure the truth outlived him. And in the end, that truth did what I never could as a child. It stood up in a room full of people, refused to apologize, and finally chose me.